Okay, and we are live. Thank you all who are joining the first ever Truth Speaks, Truth is Speaking YouTube Live. Before we get into the content on today's show, of which there is a lot, you can see it in the description. We are going to talk about Trump's recent statements on his lawlessness. We're going to talk about why planes keep falling out of the sky. We're going to talk about Doge and Eric Adams' illegal corruption scandal that is just becoming a broader political scandal. But before we get started on that, I also wanted to give some personal biography of who I am and exactly why I started Truth Speak. So we're going to give it a couple more minutes to let people come into the live. If you're listening right now, I'm glad to have you. Thank you for joining. You can start commenting if you want to introduce yourself, say hi. If you have questions, hopefully we'll have time to get to it at the end. I do not think we're going to go over the hour, but you never know. And I want to thank you guys all for being here at the very beginning, because we have a lot to talk about. So I'm going to let's give it until 7:05, and then we can get fully started and we can kick things off. But I guess I can just speak from personal experience and just watching the news and reading the news this week. It was really a challenge to think about what I wanted to cover for today, because it just feels like any time, and I feel like most of us have this experience, you just open the New York Times, you open X or Blue Sky, and you're just seeing some other outrageous thing that is happening. And a lot of people have already reported by now about how Trump's main strategy is to try and overwhelm us with information, overwhelm us with scandal. It's like that old Stalin quote, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. So it's really trying to overwhelm the senses so that it incapacitates our response. So in choosing these topics, I'm really not trying just to chase the news cycles, but I want to talk about the things that I believe are most impactful at the larger scale so that we can be most informed about where we want to focus our efforts and focus our advocacy. But now I see we're basically getting up at 7:05. So let me just start first with, what is Truth is Speaking? Why are you here? Hey, Deb, I see you in the comments. Glad to have you. But I want to start talking about, who I am, why I'm here, what I'm doing, and what I believe we are all doing and building together. So as it says on the screen, my name is Jason Chikuma. I'm in my final year at Harvard Law School. I also went to Harvard for undergrad as well. And I didn't exactly think I was ever going to be doing political commentary in any professional capacity. I do a lot of amateur political commentary with my friends. A lot of them tend to be very politically informed and engaged. And we've been having many conversations for many years about the things that have been going on in this country. But I never really thought that I would be taking any sort of direct role in it myself until now, until circumstances changed around me. I started law school in the fall of 2022. And the biggest thing that was happening at that time, we didn't know it was the beginning of an entire legal revolution. But the biggest thing that happened that summer was, of course, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And as someone coming from the left of the political spectrum, I'd always been very critical of the conservative wing of the Supreme Court, particularly after they got political power and a majority later to be a supermajority on the Supreme Court under Trump's first term. But I was still indoctrinated enough into the basic principles that I had grown up with, just in the civics classes that we took about learning about rule of law, judicial restraint, et cetera, that despite the political motivations of the judges, which I was well aware of, there were certain lines they weren't willing to cross because that would too significantly delegitimize the broader rule of law system. And as someone who was preparing to go into the profession of law, which is all about the rules and particularly the rule of law, that was a pretty bedrock assumption that I had going into things. And that was one of many times over several years where I had come to learn to expect the unimaginable, the things that I thought could never happen, would never happen, actually would happen. So that was a really trying time for me. And it was around that time that I did my first foray into any kind of political commentary on TikTok. So it was very informal. I still do some of these videos now. It's the same handle on all my social media, so you can go back and if you're interested, go to my TikTok and see the sort of videos that I posted. But it was all very informal, just like me sitting on my couch, giving my opinions, talking about things, and just seeing exactly where that went. And then once I started law school in the fall, it got a lot harder to keep up, in the day-to-day, doing the hundreds of pages of readings and being prepared for classes. It was very difficult to take the time that I wanted to be able to intelligently engage with everything that was happening around me. So, and also realistically, a part of me was also hoping that, also, hi guys, I see you guys in the comments. You guys are lovely. I promise I'm going to come back to you and as soon as I finish this bio, but I'm very happy you guys are all here. But this is a really important turning point in the story for like how I specifically got to where I am today in reacting to the current political moment that we're in, is that back in 2022, especially leading up to and immediately after the midterms, where a lot of people were worried about and suspecting a red wave, a lot of MAGA Republicans were up for governorships, secretaries of state, and we're still living in the immediate aftermath of January 6th. So the whole threat to democracy thing is still very much alive and well. So when Democrats did better than expected in that election, and just the broader theme of Biden being this return to normalcy, I wanted to believe, against my better judgment, that the crisis of Trumpism was contained. And I think that implicitly impacted the responsibility that I felt that I had, to be the person on the front lines, talking about these issues, engaging with them and talking to people about them, because I was hoping that, we had voted, we made the right choice, and that things were going to be fine from then on out. And obviously they were not. So now we're here. And it really forced me to think about, well, how am I going to use my gifts, the privileges and opportunities I've been given in life to make this country a better place? Because I know we all talk about loving our country. We talk about patriotism, and immigration is a really hot button topic. I just made a video about it, about the history of how we got to this radicalization of immigration politics. But it's very personal for me as the son of two Nigerian immigrants whose parents never let him forget, all the things they were fleeing from in their own country, corruption, the rule of the rich, the defunding of public services, the lack of respect for rule of law, a judiciary and a broader political system that the people didn't trust, that was despised. So it's been incredibly disheartening, given that context of my personal biography, watching the country that my parents fled to increasingly every day. Just reading the news, watching it every day become more and more like the place that my parents left. So to me, the stakes are very personal. I'm sure they're personal for all of us, but I'm just saying that I relate to it in a different way because of my upbringing, because of things my parents went through, because of the values that they instilled in me. So I started thinking about, okay, well, what is the right way to get involved? Like I've always had a gift for public speaking, getting up and talking. I did debate, Model UN, mock trial, in both high school and college. A bunch of people throughout the years have come up to me and said, oh, you should really run for political office. But like many of you, I became incredibly cynical and jaded about our political system, just in all of the ways in which it incentivizes the most blatant and naked forms of corruption. And worse than that, it forces you, if you want to succeed, if you want to survive, much less succeed in that system, the way in which it forces you to become corrupt just in order to have a fighting shot. So although I wanted to help and I believed at a high level of the idea of public service, I was never really sold on the idea that, getting elected to some position was necessarily going to be the best way to help people. And as I was going back, tying it back to the part about Biden and the return to normalcy and how things became very abnormal after Trump won again. And, I don't need to rehash for you all the ways in which he's actively wreaking havoc on our government. It became clear to me at the end of the last year that I should really start thinking about other ways to make my voice heard and to start getting people involved in a new movement. I'm also, another disclosure of mine, so my final paper in law school, like the 3L paper we all have to write as part of our graduation requirement, I went in a little bit of an unorthodox approach, and I wanted to do a history of Martin Luther King's political philosophy. And in studying him, his ideas, his biography, and the broader civil rights movement, I came away very captivated and inspired, particularly because, and we all are familiar with the major gains of the civil rights movement, but what I'm particularly focused on is how that was, other than abolition, it was the greatest momentous shift in a progressive direction in the country's political history. It was that Reconstruction after the Civil War and the New Deal. But what was interesting about the civil rights movement is that it is the most recent of these progressive pushes, and it was led and primarily orchestrated almost entirely from people outside of government, putting pressure on government officials to act. And I'm increasingly convinced that that is really the sort of model we need to be looking towards to think about how we get out of our own present situation. So when I'm thinking about Truth is Speaking, I don't view this as just another YouTube channel, just another live stream, just another social platform. I genuinely believe and want this to be the start of a new freedom movement in American political history, to take the country one step closer to becoming the country that it says and thinks that it actually is, even though we know that's not entirely true. We're trying to bring that reality into being through all of our collective efforts. I know that sounds like a big lift, and it is. Years ago, that may have sounded grandiose, but I think the direness of our situation that we are increasingly reminded of every day, I think is leading me and many others to the inescapable conclusion that it's only going to be another mass movement that is going to be able to save this country from itself. So that just begins in starting to have these conversations. It begins by connecting in community, which is why I'm so glad you guys are here. I think we're all in at the ground floor of what I hope, God willing, one day will be something that will be really impactful and transformative for the country. And I'm very glad that you guys all are here as part of this journey. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to go through some of these comments because you guys have all written a lot of lovely things. And then we're going to transition into some of the other content that we have for the show. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I'm seeing this one on CRT, and that's a bit of a bigger topic from Mitro. And thank you, Mitro, for this comment. I'll just show it so people know what I'm talking about. The University Departments of Law here. So this is a broader discussion that I could have on CRT. I actually have a video that should be coming out next week, not just about CRT, but more broadly, just like the whole anti-woke, anti-cancel culture hysteria that brought Trump back to power, and really sort of uncovering how I think those terms have been misused and why I actually think some version of quote unquote woke or cancel culture, it's actually needed to actually have any chance of having a democratic, multiracial society. So I don't want to get into that too much here because it's a big topic, which is why I dedicated a whole video to it. Hopefully you guys will watch it when it comes out next week. But I appreciate the questions. And this one, I get this a lot in the comments, so I want to address it here, is who funds my channel? I do. So the one positive thing that came out of, so like I said, I was at Harvard undergrad, and I'm also at Harvard Law School now. The one thing that came out of doing several of the corporate jobs that led me to this moment is that I was able to accumulate some savings, which I did not know what to do with until this time, but now I'm reinvesting basically all of that into this channel in order to increase its chances of success. But thank you for admiring the production. It is very hard to make these videos. It's very time consuming. So I appreciate all of you guys that watch and support. And Deb, thank you. Thank you for being here. Deb here is one of my Patreon patrons. I'll say more about the Patreon towards the end of the live stream, but just a short pub here that as part of building this movement, as you can imagine, speaking truth is not without its risks. It's costly, politically, personally, and just even in the time and expense it takes to really be able to do all of these things. So as much as possible, my goal, my dream for Truth is Speaking is to make it as much as possible a subscriber-led and funded community, because the more independence I have, from like either big brands or big companies, whatever it is, the easier it will be for me to keep speaking the truth without restraints independently, so that the people that I'm most beholden to are you guys at the end of the day. Of course, I understand that, all people, we have different financial constraints. And you guys just met me. I'm happy that you're here, and I hate asking for any kinds of donations or anything like that, but it's not for nothing. It does come with several additional perks, which you can see on my Patreon, which I will briefly pub right here. And I'll pub it again at the end of the video, but anything you guys can contribute is very meaningful. Any donation tier you want to sponsor at is much appreciated. And really all of it is just going to making this wonderful community that hopefully will create real change. So Deb, I thank you. And Chance, who I'm not sure is on the stream, is another patron, but I'm really grateful for all the support, and really just all the support, even you guys who are here for free, because everyone who's watching the channel, supporting it, sharing, liking, reposting, you guys are all doing some great work. So, okay, let me go back, see if I got everything. Okay, now let's get into some of the actual topics that I want to talk about today, starting with what I think it was the most important story for me this week. And the story was basically a tweet. I'm sure many of you have seen it by now, but I think it just helps for us to put it all on the screen so that we can all be on the same page. So yeah, it is, it's right on Twitter to this. People saying, "Oh, this is what a dictator sounds like. These are what dictators do." And while that's all true, I really feel doesn't really do justice to our moment this is. I mean, obviously, this is important for me, as are super important, but also bring back in the context of how I was mentioning my parents. I was mentioning my parents being from Nigeria, about how the one thing that separates the so-called advanced democracies like America from a lot of the rest of the world, which it likes to look down on, is the rule of law. The idea that one person or no person can claim any kind of exemption from the laws that govern us all. Now, that's like a general rule, but I don't think we've really grappled with what it means to be in a situation where it's not just that the president of the United States is saying this about his own power, because remember, Richard Nixon said something very similar back in the 1970s after he left office. He said, well, when the president does something, it's not illegal. The only difference is when Nixon said it, he was universally condemned by the entire political system. But we've reached a point now where in our divided, bifurcated information ecosystem, there's almost nothing that Donald Trump can say or do that all of his supporters, all of his powerful backers like Elon Musk will not immediately get behind and amplify. So no matter how extreme it is, I remember someone pointed this out a few months ago after the South Korean president who tried to declare martial law and terminate the Constitution was impeached. And that point really stuck with me on Twitter. Where he's like, if this happened in the United States, where Trump just said, I'm just going to literally declare martial law and terminate the Constitution, how it wouldn't even take 2 seconds for his entire MAGA movement to start rationalizing and justifying why he had to do what he did. And of course, coming up with all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories and lies. And what people don't understand is that, we're about 27, 28 days into this Trump presidency. I'm sure you guys have seen the stat that said it took Hitler 53 days, I think, to dismantle democracy in Germany when he took over. If this is what Trump is saying and can say now and get away with it, what this means is that there are truly no limits anymore. And we say that, but I don't think we fully understand what that means because in American history, for basically all of our history until Trump, we haven't really seriously thought about what it would mean to truly be under a dictatorship or to truly not have rule of law anymore. But I think we should really sit with that and really understand, well, okay, well, if Trump decides he doesn't want to listen to judges anymore, like then what, right? What is the recourse? He's just decided that, actually I am the law. Congress isn't going to stop me. The courts don't have a military. They don't have a police force. They don't have an army. What are they going to do about it? I remember I was talking with a friend about this a couple days ago, about what should our responsibility be? Because clearly we're watching these Democrats in Congress and they don't really know what's going on. They can't help themselves. The Democratic Party is just generally pretty useless in responding to this crisis right now. But I was talking with my friend about January 6th and think about why those people went to the Capitol. Obviously, it was all based off lies and they were going for the wrong reasons, but they went because they thought that America as they knew it, because Trump told them so, was over. They said elections don't matter. Democracy's over. If you don't do something, your country is gone forever. And those people took it upon themselves to go to the Capitol to try and take their country back. And I was asking my friend, I'm like, well, that's really interesting because, of course, although they did it for the terrible reasons, we have to ask ourselves now, watching us speedily approaching the moment that Trump lied and said was here, while he was obviously the person creating it, right? The time when American democracy ceased to function as we know it. And it creates a really interesting moral question for each and every one of us. It's like, well, what is our January 6th moment? Like, what is the line? What will have to happen for us to be like, okay, now if I don't do something personally about this or take some sort of direct action personally, then America as I know it is done. Because it should be clear by now that all of this talk is just normalizing and preparing people's minds, both friend and foe alike, for what they ultimately plan to do. There will come a time, I believe, in the next few years where even Trump's conservative court, as much as they like to roll over and give him whatever he wants, there's going to come a time when they try and push back on him and he's just going to flat out say no. And then what do we do in that situation? I actually had a piece on this. Let me respond to this comment. Crypto fascism. Okay, that's an interesting comment. I'll come back to that at the end. But my piece this week was in response not to just what Trump said here, but also J.D. Vance had another statement, I think it was earlier last week, where he basically said if a judge tries to say something Trump does is illegal, that in and of itself is illegal. And I wrote a piece talking about, well, what exactly should Democrats do in this sort of situation now that rule of law is no longer a thing? So let me share that now and we can just go over it quickly because I think it's important. So yeah, here it is. How to fight tyranny when the law no longer matters. Trump has already abandoned the Constitution, and Democrats must decide whether they will fight back within a broken system or break the system themselves to save democracy. So that's a pretty heady title, I know, for many people. But the reason why I wrote this was because we've all many of us have heard before about how basically Democrats play by the rules while Republicans have no rules. The problem is that now that the rules we're talking about in question are literally the Constitution, which means that if the Constitution doesn't apply, no rules apply. This was the alarm that I was raising about January 6th at the time, because there were even some people on the left that said that we were down, but the people who were concerned about that were downplaying it. And what never made sense to me about that argument is that there is literally no norm more fundamental in a democratic society or any society that wants to call itself a democratic society, that the person who wins the election gets the office. If that norm is gone, nothing else stands. That to me was the entire basis for the fervor of my resistance to Trump 2.0. Once I saw what he was prepared to do back then, I realized that limits do not exist for this man. That if he gets back into office, particularly if he has the military, he has all the apparatus apparatuses of the state under his control, I'm like, we'll be lucky if we can even get him to leave office, assuming he is still alive by then. So I'm seeing the Democrats, and I mentioned in this article, I'm not going to go through the whole thing right now, just in the interest of time, but you guys, are more than, you guys can read it afterwards. But I mentioned how, Chuck Schumer said he was not going to make any fuss about the debt ceiling, which the Republicans do all the time when they're in the minority. And then Hakeem Jeffries said, well, there's nothing that we can do because we don't control Congress, we don't control the courts, and we don't control the presidency. And the point that I was making was that under normal constitutional rules, Jeffries is right. He's like, the way our system works on paper is that the person who controls the right, that controls the branches of government gets to do things. The problem with that is that Trump has suspended those rules. He tried to repeal birthright citizenship by executive order. He's impounding funds and taking over Congress's ability to manage the purse and the budget. Trump had declared on the campaign, he was declaring his intention to govern as an autocrat. So if you are still trying, and that's why it just drives me crazy every time I see these tweets that mention what some new thing Trump is doing, whether it's giving Musk access to the Treasury Department information or him trying to get access to IRS information. They're like, but that's illegal. I'm like, this whole movement is illegal. It is one nonstop coup against democracy. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we'll be able to take the necessary action in order to save democracy. And in this particular article that I'm showing to you guys right now, there was an idea floated around the time when Trump won the election that the best way to, that Gavin Newsom was considering withholding California's federal income tax revenue in case Trump, violated the law or refused to be bound by the law. And Newsom never actually said this, but I'm like, that's a really interesting thought experiment to run with, because, and I'll scroll down to that part of the article that has some of the stats. But it's like blue states are like by far net contributors to the federal government. Like over half of their federal tax revenue comes from Democratic leaning states. So if they said, okay, Mr. President, you have terminated this contract with the country, therefore we are no longer bound to the terms because you are no longer bound to the terms, it would put Trump in a position where now there is another group of actors who can exercise coercive power against him, meaning they can do things to him that he does not want and does not like, which is what you need when you're dealing with a bully. That's one of the things that I mentioned in the article, that Trump is at heart a bully, and bullies only respond to power. Their only question to anything that they do to you is, well, what are you going to do about it? Can you stop me? If your answer is no, they don't care how much you insult them, how much you condemn them, how much you criticize them. As long as you can't stop them, as long as you cannot force them, if you have no sort of lever of power to prevent them from doing what they want to, you're going to be completely defenseless. But obviously this entire attitude is lost from the modern Democratic Party, as evidenced by Schumer's statement, which was also cited in this article, that they're not even going to raise, they're not going to try and do the whole debt ceiling debacle that Republicans try and do every time they are in the minority, which is why, and we'll talk more about this in future lives and different videos about how the Democratic Party, because of their inability to do what is necessary to fight fascism, they are part of the threat to democracy that fascism poses. Because as the only viable opposition party in our corrupt two-party system, if they are not the ones providing meaningful resistance to the extremism of the right, then that means there is no meaningful resistance. So the longer that party stays intact, the greater the danger we are all in. I was hoping, in my pessimistic case, that one of the only good things that would come out of Trump winning a second time would be the collapse of the Democratic Party as we know it, because all of the people who in that party who got us to this position, who kept floating weak candidates who weren't really that popular but had internal party support, they would be recognized for not knowing anything and for leading us into this mess, and that will cause a crisis of legitimacy and an internal collapse within the party. I was wrong. I had underestimated how ingrained power is in the Democratic Party, and how even if these people, they could lose the next 4 elections, and if Nancy Pelosi were still alive by then, no one would be able to do anything to her. So yeah, it is a tough position. I recommend for anyone who hasn't yet. The article has a lot more of my thoughts, but I really think that that tweet from Trump really sets the tone of what we should be expecting in the next over the next 4 years. And like how I started it off was by saying that we need to get the terminology right. I said this isn't a constitutional crisis. I saw so many people, so many lawyers, all these sophisticated people writing in the New York Times, Washington Post, etc., writing that this is a constitutional crisis. Trump is a constitutional crisis, and I'm like, no, a constitutional crisis assumes that the governing framework of the Constitution is still in effect, and this is just a momentary lapse. I'm like, the system is not merely malfunctioning, it is non-functioning right now. And we are so accustomed to the normalcy of our political system that when we see Trump doing blatantly outrageous or unlawful things, we don't have the mental capacity to see what's going on. We're trying to rationalize, justify, and explain it in the terms that seem familiar to us. It's like, oh, Trump did this illegal action, but it got blocked by the courts, and they're trying to figure out where to go from here. It's like, once you realize that Trump has two things. Trump has no intention of being bound by the law, and B, currently, with how the Democrats are choosing to fight, there is no governing institution in this country capable of making him bound by the law. And then I guess 3, the last point being that he's a person that is so narcissistic and self-serving and willing to go to any lengths to serve his own personal interests. Once you combine all of those things, like, this isn't a hyperbole, this isn't exaggeration. I'm just explaining what is the logical consequence, what is the logical progression of steps from those ingredients. Like, this is not trying to be, like a doomsday alert. I'm just saying that we should all be rightfully alarmed and being creative and thinking about what do we need to do in order to change the state of play. And currently that creativity is not coming from the people that we elect in order to do this. So we need to be thinking about, what are things, again, that's why I mentioned the January 6th moment. It's like, what are the things that it's going to take for me to be personally engaged? And also starting to build consensus that our leaders are forced to listen to, right? This goes back to like what I was saying at the beginning, a mass-led movement that puts pressure on political actors. But that starts by building a consensus about what we want politicians to do. So that's what I was trying to do with this article, and what I'm still hoping to do and talking about it now and framing it within Trump's tweet. But once again, in the interest of time, I suggest that we move on to some of the other topics that we have to discuss today. Because as you guys all know, the American government is getting so efficient by the day, thanks to Doge. That is sarcasm, of course. They are using their cost-cutting rationale as an excuse to basically gut the entire federal government and fill it with loyalists and remove any sort of impediments to the illegal actions that they want to take. There's actually a really good Guardian article about this, which I will share and show to you guys. I'm not going to cover it in depth. I just want you guys to see it so you guys can read it, because it's just a really good summary of the sort of coup that is taking place, and about how Doge is like the smokescreen to basically destroy and gut the entire federal government. So I would highly it's in the Guardian, so I would highly recommend reading that one. But anyway, it's having a lot of unintended consequences, such as making planes fall out of the sky. Which I'm sure you guys all saw the reporting on that today. Let me pull that one up as well. This is more of a local news article, but it was the most helpful summary that I found of all the recent aviation accidents that have been happening. So yeah, we heard about the Minneapolis to Toronto flight that literally flipped upside down, and it gives all the history. It gives all the history here. Until you get to, well, what is the cause? And then you realize that it is, hold on, where is it? I'm gonna find it. Here it is. Then you realize that right here, it's because of, the purges that are being driven by, quote unquote, government efficiency. And that's where we are as a country now. I remember Trump in his inauguration said that we were the golden age of America starts now. And then it feels like every other day since he's taken power, a plane falls out of the sky. And what this whole thing has made me think of, again, showing how Democrats are terrible at politics, is just imagine if this had happened under Biden. If Biden takes office, or at any point in his term, frankly, and every day some major aviation accident happened, more so particularly after massive cuts to an already short-staffed agency. That's what Trump did. That's what this article is talking about in the section that we're seeing here. The FAA was already short-staffed. They already did not have enough flight controllers. And Trump said, you know what we should do? We should go in and actively cut more personnel to make their job even harder. And then when planes started falling out of the sky, predictably, of course, he turned around and blamed DEI. And like I said at the beginning, everyone that supported him believed it without evidence. And that is just the sort of hell loop that we are going to be on indefinitely. But I mean, this should really be a preview of coming attractions for what we should be expecting over the next 4 years. I mean, luckily no one died in this plane crash, but the one at the Reagan Airport in DC where a military helicopter flew into that plane, obviously killed everybody on board. And that was barely a week or two into Trump's presidency and the direct result of his policies. I guess that's the price of the getting cheaper milk and eggs, which are even more expensive now under Trump. Totally unrelated, but it's pretty crazy. And Democrats, if they were smart, they should be on every street corner in America, screeching this into the rafters. Be like, Trump is literally firing all the air traffic controllers, and now people are dying. Yes, Burqueno, because this is relevant exactly to what I'm saying. Reagan did fire a bunch of air traffic controllers in the 1980s. And this is what people thought was going to happen when he did that, but it didn't happen. When Reagan announced it, because it was a whole showdown, for people to know, PATCO, the air traffic controllers union at the time, some of you guys were there when it happened, but they said they were going to go on strike. They wanted better pay. And Reagan said, I don't care. You guys can all quit, or I'm going to fire all of you if you guys don't go back to work. And of course, they kept the strike going. And when Reagan had made this threat, everybody, there were so many people sounding alarms in the press that, oh my God, people are going to die. What's going to happen if we don't have air traffic controllers? And because they brought in a bunch of temps and other inexperienced people. And luckily, nothing happened. But now the very thing that those people were worried about back then is happening now. And I'm sure that had to do with the fact that from Reagan till now, he's the one, this was in the first video that I made on YouTube, he was the person that brought this entire ideology of cutting, under the disguise of cutting government waste, just defunding the entire government. He's like, let's just slash, let's just cut. It doesn't really matter, making the government incapable so that the private sector is the only institution capable of responding to people's needs. And of course, our healthcare system shows us what happens when people are entirely dependent on the private sector to meet essential needs. For many things, there is no replacement for competent government work, but Reagan's entire ideology was a rebellion against that. So of course, because it started when he came into power, the planes didn't start falling out of the sky then. It took 40 odd years for us to start experiencing the consequences. That is the reason why the FAA is short-staffed in the first place, because from the Reagan era until now, it's been a steady divestment in the quality and frankly quantity of public services. So thank you for bringing up that comment, because it's directly relevant to what is happening. And of course, God only knows what's going to happen now that they have RFK and Health and Human Services. What's going to happen to our medication? What's going to happen to our food? Who even knows what's the country might not even be recognizable in 4 years in so many different ways that it's really kind of hard and scary to imagine it right now. But this is increasingly the reality that we are living in. And like I said, because of the constitutional constraints that the Democrats refuse to challenge, there's nothing that we there's nothing that politicians, I should say, are currently doing about it. What Trump proved in his first term was that impeachment is, even when Democrats are in the majority in either chamber of Congress, impeachment is not a viable political strategy anymore because you need the supermajority in the Senate in order to get rid of him. And outside of that, courts will say no. Trump has already said that he's going to ignore the courts. So exactly what do we have left? This is increasingly what we have to look forward to. But I just wanted to stop and note how crazy it is that the Democrats are not taking more advantage of this situation. Because, during the 2024 campaign, they got criticized. You guys don't know how to talk to normal people. You guys are talking about Trump being an authoritarian, and most people don't know what that is. Now we're calling Elon Musk and all those people oligarchs, and also people don't know what that is. But planes falling out of the sky, that is so understandable and terrifying to just about anybody. It could be such an effective political weapon, assuming, of course, rhetoric and things like these even matter for the purposes of winning elections, depending on how the Republicans try and run the 2026 midterms, which I'm very, very, very pessimistic about, but that will have to be a topic I get into in another video. The TLDR is that, it's going to be an all-out assault on voting rights and elections ahead of first the midterm elections and then certainly the 2028 elections. That's why, so I'll just give a little snippet of it here before we move on to the next topic, because this was something that some of my more conservative friends pushed back on me on when we were discussing Trump in this 2024 election. They're like, oh, it's kind of ridiculous to say that we're not going to have elections in 2026 and 2028. I'm like, well, the question isn't whether or not we're going to have elections. It's what kind of elections are we going to have, right? Russia has elections. North Korea has elections. China, at least at the local levels, they have elections. It's not the having election necessarily that is what matters. It's the quality of the elections. So, but we can bracket that for now, since I got a speed run through some of these other topics. I think, Mitra, you had a comment. Let me put it on the screen for people to read. So Noam Chomsky said, making the government incapable of acting by cutting funding and thus creating motivation for privatization. That's exactly what he said. Absolutely. And that is the plan. And now with the rise of not the rise, obviously the oligarchs have always been there, but they've now just seized and asserted powers in ways that are unprecedented in American history. They are finishing the project that they started with Reagan, which is why in that video that I mentioned, I tie Reagan directly to Trump. First, Reagan looks pretty mild compared to the sort of quote unquote cost cutting and really destruction of the federal government that we're seeing now, and just all of the ways in which power and wealth are being totally centralized in the hands of a few. So this will be an ongoing thing that we cover, but it's not looking great for us right now. And if you thought I was done with my criticisms of the Democrats, I am not, because there is another story that I wanted to cover. Let's see if I have it. Yes, here it is. Let me present that now. All right, here it is. That the governor of New York is apparently considering removing Eric Adams for what we're now learning was the quid pro quo deal he made with Trump, which we assumed it happened, and frankly was kind of predictable, given that Adams himself has kind of always been towards the right of things, even as the mayor of New York. And that's what everyone does now, right? If you have a federal criminal case you want to get out of, the best thing you can do is go to Donald Trump, because he gets all of his cronies out of jail. But the thing that we didn't know until the last couple of days was what exactly did Eric Adams agree to give Trump in exchange for his prosecutorial immunity. And of course, it was helping with this massive immigration crackdown that Trump wants to do. So the governor of New York is meeting with her political advisors to consider removing Adams from power. And I just thought this was such a good example of how useless the Democrats can be sometimes. They're having a meeting to consider. There's a whole political crisis going on, clear corruption, and this guy is selling out his own state and basically the rule of law in order to protect himself. And you guys are considering using the powers that you lawfully have under your own state constitution and taking all this time to deliberate. If this were a Republican governor and some sort of deal like this had happened on the other side, Eric Adams would have been out of a job since yesterday at least. At least. It's just all the ways in which they choose to refuse to leverage and utilize the power that they already have to deal with existing problems. It just actually drives me nuts. Like what could they possibly be meeting to debate and consider? Also, mind you, if Eric Adams is removed, he has no more value to Trump. He can't assist Trump anymore in the immigration crackdown. So if what you were worried about was the incentive structure of letting people just do secret corrupt deals with Trump in order to evade responsibility for their crimes, this would be a good step in making sure that doesn't actually happen. But I guess they're taking time to do what they should have done about a week ago. So yeah, that was just one more criticism I had of the Democrats. And we can go on to the next story. Let me see. Who is the Antichrist? Good question, Jonathan. That will also be in the future video. I don't want to get too much into it here, but we are going to talk about religion. And I might have to skip over some other stories to make sure we get to this one first. So I'm glad you asked, because that will bring us into our next topic, which I'm sure many of you have already heard about. And let me pull up the article now. Where is it? Yes. Here it is. So the Pope had some very choice words for Trump and Vance in a strongly worded letter to the bishops in the the Catholic bishops in the United States, particularly about the new administration's perspective on immigration. If you haven't read the letter, I highly recommend you do. This was prompted by, and it's listed here in the article, Vance's own understanding of Christian theology, in which you actually don't have to love your neighbor. You can just love all the people you like first, your friends, your family, your communities, and then you can broaden out the scope of concern from there. And then the Pope said that's literally not how Christian love works. The entire idea is that it is universal. And when Jesus in the Sermon of the Mount said, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy," he said, no, actually, you should love your enemy as well. And when he's telling you to love, and then when he says in Luke 10, love your neighbor as you love yourself, he makes it very clear through the parable of the Good Samaritan, which the Pope highlights in his response, that your neighbor is everybody. So I actually want to read briefly from the Pope's letter, because I just think it's absolutely excellent. And like I said, if you haven't read it, I really think you should, because it's just that good. So I'm going to do that briefly now. And here it is. He says, hold on, let me put it on the screen. And he says, "I'm writing today to address a few words to you in these delicate moments that you are living as pastors of the people of God who walk together in the United States of America. The journey from slavery to freedom that the people of Israel traveled, as narrated in the book of Exodus, invites us to look at the reality of our time, so clearly marked by the phenomenon of migration, as a decisive moment in history to reaffirm not only our faith in a God who is always close incarnate, migrant and refugee, but also the infinite transcendent dignity of every human person. These words, which I begin, are not an artificial construct. Even a cursory examination of the church's social doctrine emphatically shows that Jesus Christ is the true Emmanuel. He did not live apart from the difficult experiences of being expelled from his own land because of an imminent risk to his life, and from the consequences of having to take refuge in a society and a culture foreign to his own. The Son of God, in becoming man, also chose to live the drama of immigration. I like to recall, among other things, the words of Pope Pius XII, who began his apostolic constitution on the care of migrants, which is considered the Magna Carta of the church's thinking on immigration. The family of Nazareth in exile, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, immigrants in Egypt and refugees there to escape the wrath of an ungodly king, are the model, the example, and the consolation of immigrants and pilgrims of every age and every country, of all refugees of every condition, who, beset by persecution or necessity, are forced to leave their homeland, beloved family, and dear friends for foreign lands. Likewise, Jesus Christ, loving everyone with the universal love, educates us in the permanent recognition of the dignity of every human being without exception. In fact, when we speak of, quote, infinite and transcendent dignity, we wish to emphasize that the most decisive value possessed by the human person surpasses and sustains every other juridical consideration that can be made to regulate life in society. Thus, all the Christian faithful and people of goodwill are called upon to consider the legitimacy of norms and public policies in the light of the dignity of the person and his or her fundamental rights, not vice versa. So those are obviously very powerful words and a stinging rebuke from the Pope, particularly to Vance, who just converted to Catholicism recently as part of his rebranding to an ultra right-wing conservative. But what's interesting to me about this statement is, not just that the Pope is speaking truth, but I like the ways in which he's spiritualizing the political debates and arguments that are going on in our country, because I believe they fundamentally are spiritual. What this made me think of, a Bible verse that came to mind was, and I'll get to all the questions at the end for those who want to stick around. Jonathan, I see your question, and also Kodachrome Railroad Videos. It's a funny name. I see your questions as well, but I'll get through this story and then I'll run through the questions and then we can wrap, and I'll tell you guys when the next live stream is. To answer your question, I'm expecting it to be on Monday next week, 7 p.m. Monday should be the normal times. If I was feeling more up to speed yesterday, less under the weather yesterday, I would have done it then, but it just got delayed to today for that reason. But the plan is to do them every Monday at 7 and just kind of like run through a lot of these stories. But because you guys asked about the Antichrist, I wanted to bring up this Bible verse in relation to the Pope's comments, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in 2 Thessalonians, when Paul is talking about the second coming of Jesus, and how that will not happen until the, quote, man of lawlessness is revealed, the one that Jesus will overthrow by the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming. And the reason why this verse is so powerful, let me put it up on the screen so you guys can see what I'm talking about. The reason why this verse is so powerful is because, particularly the language of a strong or powerful delusion that Paul uses later on in the verse, I think it just describes, it's a really incredible metaphor to describe what it feels like is going on with the support that Trump is enjoying in the political system, particularly amongst people who call themselves Christians. That's what my last video was, or second to last video was about. That's what the Pope statement was about. It's just so incomprehensible on a logical level how, Jesus wasn't hiding the ball on his social ethics. It's literally at the center of the religion, to love your neighbor, to love yourself. You can't say you love God who you haven't seen, while you hate your brother and sister who you have seen. Whoever hates a brother and sister does not have the truth of God in them, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's abundantly clear. So to have people voting for someone, and not just voting, actively and enthusiastically supporting someone who so goes against everything that they claim to believe in their religion. It's not logical. I do believe that much of that is, the vast majority of that is spiritual. I think they have a real dark spiritual attachment to something that Trump stirs up inside of them, right? It's like when Jesus talks about how it's not what goes into a person that defiles them, it's what comes out. And there are other verses in the Bible, like from Jeremiah, about the heart being deceitful amongst above all things, and also from Proverbs 4 about how we need to guard our hearts above everything else, because everything we do flows from it. All Trump did was activate things that were latent potentials that were already contained within the hearts of these people, and they formed a really durable, incredibly strong, dark spiritual bond through that, which prevents them from coming to the light, from coming to the truth, because of the spiritual relationship that they have. So as Paul was saying in this, they would be given over to a strong delusion that they would believe a lie. And all of this, when you see whether it's the planes, again, I believe this stuff as a Christian, when you just see the increasing disorder in the world, which is now just most dramatically represented by planes falling out of the sky, by the polarization, by people at each other's necks. It's like when Jesus talked about the love of many will grow cold when the increase of because of the increase of lawlessness in the world. It is this secret power of lawlessness, the secret power of iniquity that's being revealed in greater and greater ways to the world. And Trump is just increasingly like the embodiment of that. I mean, that's why we started off with talking about his literal lawlessness, his literal disregard for the laws. That is part of who he is as a person, because he is the representative of this later stage of humanity when people will start, it's the great falling away. It's not just walking away from religion or Christianity in particular, but walking away from any sense of norms and decency and self-control. And again, I already talked about it before, but the cancel culture woke video I'm talking about is exactly precisely on that topic, about how you need to have those limitations in order to have a functional, healthy, and just society. So it was a really powerful rebuke from the Pope. And another thing that I'm working on, I know I've teased so many videos, but this is what I'm doing in most of my free time. But it'll be a more thoughtful exploration of, how should Christians be thinking about immigration. And the Pope did a really good job in like setting out some of the basics of that. But I really want to wrestle with the all of the moral complexity of like, well, what does it mean to really want to love people and to have the sort of radical compassion that Jesus had for people, the heart that he had for people that's literally represented in the plaque on the Statue of Liberty about give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. Okay, but how do you operationalize that and turn it into actual policy? So I see we are at 8. And what I'll do is I have one question from Deb, which I'll show now, because that is one of the perks of being a patron. Some extra engagement. And I think she had a question that you guys would all be interested in about, are Republican senators ever present when Democrats speak, or do they skip debates because they already know how Trump wants them to vote? Are they required to be on the floor? And I think that's a typo there, but like, what are the rules that basically govern their presence in the Senate? So that's a procedural rule that has important political implications. So to answer your question, Deb, no, they technically, well, yes and no. Yes, they technically, in order for the Senate to function, they have to have a quorum of senators, which is 51, but you only need to have a quorum if someone makes a quorum call. And then the head of the Senate has to literally go through manually and see if there are 51 senators that are there in order to conduct the business of the Senate. That almost like never really happens. The informal rule is that like, yeah, people can just like go and come whenever, and it doesn't really matter. No one's gonna check, essentially. But that was cited as one of, if you guys follow Legia Miller on, subscribe to her channel on YouTube, that was one of the things that she mentioned Democrats could start using more often to slow down Trump's legislative agenda, like quorum calls and things like that, just like slow down the process. My response to that, of course, and this goes back to Trump's lawlessness, is that notice how none of the crazy things that he wants to do or has been doing in the past couple of weeks require legislation. His party controls Congress, the party that is ready to roll over him and do whatever he wants at every whim. And he's like, actually, guys, I don't really need you right now. I'm just going to sign whatever executive order I want to do anything and just rule by decree. That's the state where we're at with things. But in theory, yes, there could be quorum calls. Those could be used to slow things down. Where presence actually matters more in the day-to-day in the Senate in real life is during votes. So a senator has to be present to vote. If they are not present, they can't vote. So that is something where the presence actually matters. But to your question of, okay, are they listening to the Democrats speak when on the floor? I guess it's kind of already answered in the first part, but generally, no. I mean, Democrats don't listen to Democrats most of the time on the floor, and Republicans don't listen to Republicans. People are the congressmen and senators are out kind of doing their own thing most of the time, and generally only are there on the floor of the House or Senate when they have to be. So no, I don't think they're mostly listening to each other, and even if they were, I don't think it would necessarily really accomplish anything, because, like I said, Trump isn't even asking them to vote on anything right now. Trump is just doing his dictator thing, and they're just kind of like, it's fine. We're not going to push back on him. Sure, he wants to take away our constitutional powers, to like decide how the government's funded. But he's president, and who cares? So it's less of a live issue for them right now. Okay, let me look at some of these other comments. Let me put this banner down. Oops, and then we can wrap. Okay, let's see. Is Trump the Antichrist? So like I said, we're going to talk about this in another video, but I can give you the long and short of my answer now, which is kind of short. I have my suspicions, but the reason why I don't want to say definitively is just because the one thing the Bible encourages us to do in conversations about the end times is not be so certain that we know we're living in the end times. Like Jesus's own followers, like his disciples, thought that when Jesus himself came, at the time that they saw him was going to be the time that all the things that he spoke about, the kingdom of God and everything, was going to happen in the way and in the timeline that they thought it was going to happen. And so anytime I'm talking about eschatology and the end of the world and the Christian ideas of like the second coming, I always want to have a fundamental posture of humility in the same way that Jesus did. He said himself, he's like, I don't even know when it's going to happen. He said, the only person that knows is God the Father. And he was very clear about that. So I'm very humble in my expectations about, interpreting the signs. Granted, we are given signs. We are given signs for a reason. It's like, as Paul says in First Thessalonians, he's like, you're supposed to have this knowledge that you're aware of what is happening. And Jesus himself talks about discerning the signs of the time. So that's all important. We should continue to do that for those of us who are Christians and feel called. We should keep trying to interpret the signs of the times, because even if they are not right in an absolute sense, they are almost always right in an approximate sense. So even if Trump is not the quote unquote man of lawlessness, he displays the character and the type of the Antichrist. That's why I love so much in John's letter, how he says he doesn't just say the Antichrist is coming. He says already many Antichrists have come. So he cues us into the spiritual theological fact that although there is one Antichrist at the end of time, at the end of the world, that the spirit of the Antichrist is a type that repeats itself in multiple individuals across time, space, culture, societies, and that it's in discerning that spirit, and it has several attributes, many of which I listed in the video that I made, but which I said I had to do another video on it because there's so many Antichrist specific attributes that need to be explored in greater depth, most of which, frankly, that I think Trump fits to a T. That I think we should be using our discernment as Christians to be able to think about, well, what are the spiritual implications of noticing these patterns, of seeing these signs, etc. So it's a more complicated answer to, is Trump the Antichrist? Trump, I think, certainly is an Antichrist. I don't think he is the Antichrist, just because he embodies the spirit that is antithetical, to, as I said, to everything that Christ taught, beyond just having more character similarities to the figure of the Antichrist as it's described several times in the Bible. So I hope that is a helpful answer. Yes. Speaking of Antichrist and wolves in sheep's clothing, Trump didn't even bother to put on sheep's clothing. He just came out and said, "I am a wolf," and people are like, "Wow, he tells it how it is." Again, this is why I said it's a strong delusion, because that's not rational. That's not logical. Someone just comes out and tells you, "I'm a terrible, awful person," and then your response to that is, "Wow, he's just like, he represents me." Like this, like something deeper is going on. So yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, dark spiritual bond makes sense. That was off the dome, I don't think I've ever phrased it that way until now, but I think that's one of the ways to understand what is happening. Jonathan, you said you had one final question, and I'm not sure if I see the question in the comments. I don't know what this reference to Leon is, L, but maybe you can handle that offline. And yeah, Deb, I totally feel you. Like I said, the Dems are useless. The sooner that party collapses so we can get a real opposition party, the better for the country. And like what I said earlier, I'm just very distressed by how entrenched their power is, because every day in and of itself is a political crisis. And I frankly don't think we have 4 years in order to turn this country around, to turn the situation around. Like, by the time that MAGA is done doing what it's going to do, assuming that they're even done in 2028, right? Assuming they don't just change so many rules and fundamentally rig so many things in their favor that we effectively get what I was worried about during this election, indefinite one-party rule. You know, it may be too late in the short term to do something based off of the political leaders that we have right now. But I'm hoping that's not the case, which is why we're here talking about alternatives, and which is why we really have to be thinking about movement creation and movement leadership. Like this, like the politicians cannot save us. They can't even save themselves. They're just happy collecting their checks, getting flown out by their corporate donors. Like they are, even when they go on TV and make noise and talk to cameras and act like they have empathy, it's like these people are fundamentally ill-equipped to deal with the situation that they have helped get us into, and the Democrats in particular, because of their, you know, really ossified and frankly corrupt leadership and propping up all of these unpopular candidates that don't really have popular support, but they're just good at scheming the system, like the internal DNC system. I mean, this could have been another story that we covered, and I guess we're getting into a little bit now, but if you look at the new head of the DNC, and you know, even the New York Times, they were all being honest about how this guy was selected. They're like, yeah, his only real talent is being close with a bunch of DNC insiders and the establishment. And I'm like, oh wow, did we literally learn nothing from the last 3 presidential cycles? And yes, I'm counting Joe Biden as another unpopular Democratic leader, even before he became historically unpopular in his second term. I mean, people forget in 2020, like people forget what like living through the summer of 2020 felt like. It basically felt like the world was ending. We had this virus that had shut down political life. There were protests in the streets unlike anything we had seen since the civil rights movement. It truly felt like the very fabric of society was unraveling. That was Trump, minus how much lower he went after January 6th. But that was Trump basically at the bottom of his political popularity. And he only lost the election by roughly 40,000 votes in 4 states. That's how close it was in 2020. There are more seats in TD Garden here in Boston than the margin that Biden won by, of like the votes he needed in the right states in order to get the electoral victory win against Trump. So it's like, yes, 3 historically unpopular candidates. So yeah, it's pretty bad. And yeah, Mitra, I like this comment here. It's not the point if Trump is the Antichrist. He has clear character of, you know, Antichristness. That is real. Yeah, and Jonathan, we can connect offline about this. If you go to my YouTube channel, my contact info is in my bio, info at Truth is Speaking, 1S. Would love to talk more about your spiritual journey. And yes, Ellie, it is scary how out in the open they've been, because they're not trying to hide anything, right? They are actively bragging about the crimes they are going to commit. Trump used these crimes. He used the very lawlessness that he's practicing in office as a campaign rhetoric. That's why people are like, oh my God, can you believe Trump is doing all the things that you said he was going to do? Of course I can, because he can't. That's what he ran on. There is nothing that Trump is doing right now. There's nothing that Trump is doing right now they didn't actively tell us he was going to do. Him and the people around him didn't tell us they were actively going to do if they got power back. So it's like, what is there to hide? We were all witnesses to the crime. That's why I never understood why they did those like long drawn out House committee to discuss January 6th. It's like, we were all witnesses to the crime. We all know what happened. You could have filed the charges immediately, but yeah, anyway. Thanks for coming, Mitro. Sorry to miss you before I go. But yeah, like I said, next live stream, everybody, will be Monday at 7 p.m. I'll send another post. But before you guys go, I do want to give one very, very last pub for my Patreon for the people that weren't here. Like I said, Deb, if you're still here, thank you again for being one of the first Patreon members. Like I said, this is all supported by you guys. And the more that I'm supported by you, the more honestly and authentically I can continue to communicate truth. You guys are the backbone of this channel. And I understand whatever financial difficulties people are under, but I really thank everyone's being here tonight, supporting, engaging. I really believe we're building something really special. And yes, even when I can't get through all of the comments, you guys should feel free to connect with me, not just over email, but I believe all my socials are in the descriptions of my YouTube video. And I believe I should also have my link tree on my actual YouTube page. So please connect with me on there, DM me. Would love to keep the conversation going. No, I have not heard of the this movement. I heard about it a couple years ago, but I didn't really think anything was happening with it. But I have to revisit to see if they've gained any new steam. But thank you guys all for coming. And yes, please pray for Jonathan. And we will all talk next week. And please stay tuned for the next Truth Speaks YouTube video, which will be uploaded later this week. God bless you all. Have a great night and see you next week.